At what point do you stop trusting a person or an organization in your personal life? Um, you're probably wondering, if this person lies to me once and then they apologize and say, I'll never do it again, and then they do it again, then you're like, okay, I don't know if I can trust these people. But yet, people still trust organizations in the government, although they lie over and over again or misrepresent the truth. Think back to '08 when Ben Bernanke was saying, oh, well, I don't see any problems in the housing sector. There's no systemic risk. And you're hearing very similar things from Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries today. Now, are they lying? Yes. Are they? Do they know the truth? In other words, and yet they're lying to you. The answer is yes. And the premises yesterday was, are they doing it intentionally as well? When it comes to these new banking protections for big banks, if the premise yesterday was that Jerome Powell knew this was coming, because he's not dumb. He knew it would collapse small banks, and then on top of that, he insured to infinity big banks, and they have not reversed that yet. So, what is the net outcome? Because intentions don't really matter. What's the outcome of that? Banks have infinity insurance. Oh, by the way, does anybody know what that ding is? I've turned off every single notification on my dang computer, and that still comes up and dings. I don't know what the heck it is. Somebody mentioned it that it's annoying, and yeah, I know it is annoying. I don't know what the heck it is. I don't know how to turn it off. So if you know, let me know in the comments. Anyways, so Jerome Powell came out and said, "Hey, you know, yesterday everything's fine. We don't see any systemic risk, yada yada yada." And yet they have this protection for big banks, Infinity Insurance, but small banks not necessarily going to get that. So if that isn't reversed, the run on these small banks will continue. And so, as Yellen said during her hearing, that's not our intention. Who cares, lady? That's what's happening. It doesn't matter what your intention is. And to be honest, in yesterday's premise, that is their intention because they knew this was coming and they did nothing about it. And I'm not the only one saying this. Senators and congressmen are noticing this as well. So let's take a look at what John Kennedy has to say. This is a senator from Louisiana, great Southern accent. Let's hear what he has to say about the SVB crisis.
The risk that the management of SVB Bank took. But today, this is what I learned this week. I want to talk about the mistakes that were made by the federal government in supervising this bank. Fact number one. It is a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve, which is one of the banking regulators in charge of supervising the bank, issued a warning to the bank. This is 4 years ago over its risk management systems. 4 years ago, the Fed told Silicon Valley Bank that its system to control risk was not up to snuff. Fact number two. Last fall, short sellers and private bank analysts said the same thing. What, 5 months ago? 6 months ago? Fact number three. Some of my colleagues have said, we didn't have sufficient regulation. I don't know how you regulate greed. I don't know how you regulate stupidity, but I'm referring now to the management of Silicon Valley Bank. But it wasn't a failure of regulation that caused Silicon Valley Bank to go under. It was the failure to enforce the rules that we already have.
So you got to ask yourself, in yesterday's video, I said many times, this was all documented and known by the FDIC, by the Fed, and by regulators. So now they're pouring gasoline on the fire of confidence, because not a lot of people have confidence in their banks, right? by backing up larger banks and not smaller banks in response to this thing they already knew about. So, as Senator Kennedy is pointing out, um, we just didn't enforce the rules on the books. Now, was somebody asleep at the wheel, or was this not a mistake, but intention, an intended outcome? That's for you to make your mind up on, but let's continue listening to what he's saying.
I just explained to you, here's the article from the Wall Street Journal. The Federal Reserve, one of the banking regulators in charge of Silicon Valley Bank, knew in January of 2019, the bank was criticized for its risk control practices. And they were supposed to correct those risk control practices. Why didn't the Federal Reserve follow up? Now, I also learned some of my colleagues are saying, well, this is all the fault of Congress. It's the fault of Congress because Silicon Valley Bank was not subject to a stress test. We, as you know, Democrats and Republicans supported an amendment to Dodd-Frank back in 2018 that some say prevented the bank from being stress tested. That's not true. The bill that we passed in 2018 said categorically and unequivocally, look at Title 12, Chapter 2, Subchapter A, Part 252, Subpart A, Section 252.3. It said in our legislation that the Federal Reserve and the other banking regulators had the authority at any time to stress test Silicon Valley Bank. And they chose not to do it. Now, the other point being made by some of my colleagues is that, well, they weren't big enough to stress test. They had to be $100 billion or more. That's not true. They were over a $100 billion bank at the end of 2021. So they did qualify to be stress tested in 2022. One of the other things we've learned, Mr. President, is that in 2022, the Federal Reserve stress tested 34 banks. Silicon Valley Bank was not one of them, as I said. They could have been. Under the rules, they qualified. They were supposed to be. They were over $100 billion. And even had they not been over $100 billion, the Federal Reserve could have said, we're going to stress test them anyway under our legislation. Because back in February or January of 2019, we were worried about their risk control. But for whatever reason, we're going to find out the Federal Reserve chose not to stress test them. The Federal Reserve issued a report on its stress tests from 2022. Here it is.
Say hello to a new way to rent, where you can be in Seattle in March, LA in October.
If the Federal Reserve had stress tested Silicon Valley Bank, Silicon Valley Bank would have passed. It would have passed. You know why? Because the Federal Reserve, in its stress testing in 2022, didn't stress test interest rate risk. They just stress tested credit risk.
So what does that tell you about other banks? I'm going to do a story later today. There's a lot of risk in the system with interest rates, not just for treasuries, but for mortgage-backed securities, commercial mortgage-backed securities to be specific.
I just find that extraordinary. In 2022, we were experiencing raging inflation. The Fed was raising interest rates. The Fed understands that when you hold a long government bond or a long treasury, that its value decreases as interest rates go up. You would think that the first thing the Federal Reserve would stress test for was interest rate risk and duration risk. But it didn't.
Hmm.
It didn't, and I am at a loss to understand. Mr. President, now the Federal Reserve has announced, I think the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Barr, has announced that he's going to be in charge of finding out what went wrong. And Mr. Barr is a fine person. And nothing I say today should be construed to suggest that he's not. But Mr. Barr has a conflict of interest. His own agency contributed to the downfall of Silicon Valley Bank.
I'll link the whole video in the description below, but you guys can watch the rest if you want. But again, do intentions matter? At the end of the day, not really. And so when the Fed and the Treasury say this isn't our intention and they play stupid, that's one thing I would always throw out. They are not stupid. They know this. This is banking 101, interest rate risk. So why did they not stress test interest rate risk? And then why are they responding by saying they're only going to back up specific banks? You can answer that yourself, but it seems kind of nefarious to me. It seems like they want certain banks to collapse. Number one, that creates deflation. And they want to consolidate power. So it's going to create deflation and give them more power. I don't know. You guys let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share this video out. I'd be really appreciative of that. And I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.